in 2000. You want me to do that again?
Yeah, start.
Hello and welcome to this special interview. With me is the US former National Security Advisor, Stephen Hadley. He was, in fact, one of the founders of the India-US Strategic Partnership in the past decade. Mr. Hadley, thanks so much for speaking to us at The Hindu. You have come from a visit to Pakistan and Afghanistan at a time when talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban seem to be at a precarious stage. Give us a sense of how hopeful you are of those talks working out, particularly given the announced death of Mullah Omar.
Well, I think they've had a start. There have been 2 meetings, one in Urumqi, which was confidential, once in Murray, which was more public. Obviously, there was disarray and disagreement within the Taliban movement before, and the announcement about the death some 2 years ago of Mullah Omar and the then succession or leadership crisis that is touched off has actually certainly exacerbated those tensions. So I think we're in a pause, and we really don't know at this point where this process is headed until there's some sorting out within the Taliban and, quite frankly, between the Taliban and the Pakistanis. I think the mood in Afghanistan was that there's a lot of skepticism about the talks, whether they would succeed, and that's before the second Murray meeting was suspended and the turmoil within the Taliban became public. There was a lot of skepticism, but there was also, I think, a sense, even among the skeptics, that this was a course of action that needed to be pursued. And that if a large number of Taliban could actually be brought out from the insurgency, that would help buy some time for the Indian government and for its military to deal with what is a very difficult situation.
You mentioned the Indian government, yet the perception in India is that India has been frozen out, that the US and China were happy to go to the talks in Murray to almost give them a seal of approval for being successful talks. And yet India has not been consulted or involved in this process at all because, of course, that would be inconvenient to Pakistan. How would you respond to that?
Well, I hope India has been consulted by the United States. I think it is obviously India is not going to be able to show up at the talks, but they are important. They have a direct bearing on India's security. So I would hope that India and the United States have had very frank conversations about this, and I would hope that there is an understanding between the United States and India about how these should proceed and how India's legitimate concerns about this process would be and will be addressed. And I would hope that the run-up to the Prime Minister's visit to Washington is an occasion for those conversations so that the Prime Minister and the President, when they meet, can have a frank conversation. And India and the United States need to be on the same page with respect to these talks.
I do want to come back to that conversation on terrorism, but as somebody who has followed the Afghanistan situation for so long, there used to be red lines that anyone who went into negotiation with the Afghan government would abjure violence to begin with, would accept the constitution, and it would be an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned process. Instead, what we're seeing is essentially Pakistan running the process, while it isn't at all clear that any of those preconditions have been followed. Have, in fact, the red lines been put aside?
I'm not sure they were red lines. They're clearly things that are what Afghanistan would like coming out of these talks. But remember where we were. The Taliban position for a long time was that they would not talk to the Afghan government. They did not recognize the Afghan government as legitimate. They would only talk to the United States, and really the only thing they wanted to talk to the United States about was getting out of the country. So that's where we were. Where we are now is that the Taliban are sitting down with representatives of the Afghan government. And they are being sponsored by Pakistan. That is true. And I think Afghans would tell you that's just the reality of the measure of control that Afghans believe Pakistan has always had over the Taliban. The fact that the United States and China are participating as observers, I think, is a good sign. So I think it represents progress. Is it perfect? No. But I think it represents some progress and an opportunity. But again, these are very difficult, as India well knows, especially with the announcement yesterday, bringing a long-standing insurgent group out of the insurgency is a very hard thing to pull off.
All right, you're referring first to the Naga peace process. In Afghanistan, the threat of ISIS seems to loom larger. Certainly President Ghani has expressed his worry about it. You're in Delhi at a time when India is facing a hostage crisis. 2 men still remain in what India believes is ISIS-affiliated militia groups in Libya. 2 men were released last week. So the question I really want to ask you is, as you come to this region, how do you think India should see the ISIS threat?
I think it's very worrying, and India should see it as very worrying. This is probably, we all thought Al-Qaeda was a serious threat, and this is sort of Al-Qaeda 2.0 or 3.0 in terms of its brutality and in terms of its ambitions, which is to obliterate borders, establish a theocratic-based caliphate over the region, and pursuing that objective with really brutal tactics. And the problem is, it's now established itself as the biggest and baddest of the terrorist groups, and in a way the most successful, precisely because it controls a lot of territory in Iraq and Syria, something that Al-Qaeda aspired to and never was able to do. And the risk is that all kinds of terrorist groups, in order to enhance their legitimacy and maybe get some funds, will adopt the black flag of the Islamic State and adopt the tactics of the Islamic State. And there are any number of terrorist groups, some of them directed at India, who might take advantage of that opportunity. That ought to be very worrying to India, and it's why India ought to be supportive of any effort, reasonable effort, that brings down terrorism, that takes people out of terrorism in a way that, of course, respects India's national security interests.
All right, you're saying India